First story. You're all dead. We were sitting around a campfire. The sky was dark and almost black, and the air was a bit chilly for a summer's night. At first, it was quiet. The fire crackled, someone walked along the dry pine needles, and the girls talked in low voices. I glanced at them sideways. I didn't recognize half of them. There were 4 boys and 4 girls. I felt awkward. I didn't know why I had come along. I'm not fond of social outings in nature, and all of the conversations somehow passed me by. But then again, that's just how it happened. I couldn't back out of the trip. Anyway, it's not too far from the city, and the place itself isn't bad. As soon as it got dark, I could smell the direction the conversation was heading. And so, it turned out that way. One of my friends, John, who had been drawing something on the ground with his stick, suddenly suggested, "Let's tell ghost stories." "Scary?" a pretty red-haired girl asked doubtfully. "Yeah, well, and what about it?" John shrugged and looked at me. "How are you?" I was surprised to hear they were addressing me directly. I wasn't really interested, so I simply nodded. Nobody seemed enthusiastic about the idea, but we still perked up slightly. I moved closer to the fire and a wave of hot air enveloped me. "Anyway, Ariana," the red-haired woman, hesitated. "I'll start." It seemed to me she just wanted to move on from the subject. After a brief silence, she began to speak. "I'd like to tell you about a girl who stayed at home that night alone. So she stayed at the computer till late. In the dark room, only the monitor was flickering. She was even too tired to get up, and it was kind of cold. She sat there, clicked the mouse, browsed the sites. Then suddenly she turned her head and everything inside her shrank with fear. Someone was sitting on a chair right by the door. So calmly, just like that. Not a tall human figure, but a person. He did not move, and it was unclear whether he was looking. It was dark, so the face was not visible. And the switch, it was right next to him, on his shoulder. To turn on the light, one had to come closer. And the girl could not even squeak. He was sitting there shaking, and the silence was scarier than anything. Because the figure was silent and did not move, it was like a stone statue. And the girl slowly got up and walked with wobbly legs towards the switch. She seems to be getting closer, but nothing seems to get any better. Her face is hidden in the shadow, and then he sees her eyes. 2 cloudy, unblinking proteins. The eyes look right at her, and it's getting terribly cold. Her teeth are chattering, and she needs to reach out to turn on the light, but she believes it will help her. It's scary to extend your hand, like past a dog's face. What if this creature moves? Will it grab you? The girl has already lifted her hand almost up. The figure doesn't move, only the eyes stare, unblinking. And then, abruptly, the girl raises her hand and presses a button. He watches her do it, but when he looks at the chair, it's empty. She feels like a weight has been lifted off her shoulders, but she also can't hide her hysteria. Sobbing, he goes to the kitchen and drinks water to calm down, and the lights were off everywhere. Why burn in vain when no one was at home? She froze in the doorway because, in the kitchen, next to the light switch, there was a dark figure. The one and only. And then, naturally, the girl screamed in fear and ran to the front door. And then there was the heavy sound of footsteps. Bom bom bom. She grabbed the handle, nearly ripping it out by the roots. And a cold hand fell on her shoulder. "Is that it?" one of the girls asked quietly, the blonde one and, apparently, the youngest. She sounded genuinely scared, but I was amused at her reaction. The others, in my opinion, weren't impressed by the story. Anya nodded and turned her head slightly towards the dark forest, shuddering. Then she added in a casual voice, "Who's next?" Surprisingly, the coward volunteered. Apparently, that day the girls had decided to take charge, or maybe they were just mentally preparing themselves for another person's story. "I'll tell you," I said. I was studying her face. She was nervously twisting her hands and looking away. "Who is she?" "Is that Susie? Do you know? There are lots of stories about different types of maniacs who operate in forests and parks, right? For example, someone might return from work late and a maniac could be right there. It's not guaranteed that they'll be caught, but there are other stories. 2 girls once stayed the night in a forest with a group. It was a great overnight stay, with a nearby lake and a campfire and couples scattered around their tents. One night, it was necessary for them to go for a short walk. Well, it was scary and she invited her friend along. She was shy to ask the other girl to come with her, but she finally agreed. The 2 moved away from the camp, the second girl stayed nearby. And now, the girl was just about to sit down when suddenly she felt a cold air blowing on the back of her head and the wheezing sound was muffled. She squeaked in a ridiculous way, turned around sharply, no one. She called her friend's name, muttered something unpleased. She was frozen and that was that. The girl was blinking her eyes. Well, I heard her thinking. She turned away, and then it was even worse. She felt right behind her. It was as if she had appeared there instantly. Step back, and she would hit her back. She heard her breathing. Almost as if by magic, it turned around, empty. And then, her panic was so overwhelming that she rushed without looking where she was going. And someone was running after her. The sound of footsteps, the branches cracking, she breathed heavily, and it seemed to her that her back was sometimes touched by the tips of her fingers, but a few inches was not enough to grasp. And the girl had lost her voice. She just wheezed softly and ran, afraid to fall. The pursuer did not move away or approach, as if the shadow had stuck to her. Her lungs were already burning and she was sweating profusely. She almost crashed into a tree and slowed down, looked over her shoulder, no one. And then she was standing. It was scary to move. It was also scary to stand still. There was someone behind her. Someone else's breathing chilled her earlobes. She asked who it was, begged to leave, but nothing changed. Then the girl lost consciousness from the horror and fell. Her friends went to search for her in the morning, but she was nowhere to be found, only a tuft of blonde hair hanging from a branch, that was all. And again, there was hardly any reaction. I looked in surprise at the tense faces. What's wrong with these people? It's either boring, damn it, or everyone is taking it seriously. I'm more interested in watching rather than listening to the stories. The girls appear to be scared, while the guys seemed somewhat distracted, sitting and thinking about it. I waited to see who would speak next, and then John chimed in. You have some stories about psychopaths. Now I'll add a little more color. Are you ready? He smiled and, for a moment, paused purely to enhance the atmosphere before finally beginning to tell his tale. In general, superstitions are just that, superstitions. Sometimes, really weird things do happen, but that's just the nature of the beast. There was only one man in particular. He was a true comic genius, adoring parodies and imitating different voices. It would have been great if he managed to get into a comedy show, but unfortunately, he was not quite old enough and did not have enough experience. He liked to make funny faces in front of the mirror and make up jokes, which was rather like a rehearsal for what he might do on stage. And then there was his sister, who was a wonderful person. I don't know whether I saw a horror movie, or read a book, or maybe it was just a thought that came to her mind. She told him not to look in the bathroom mirror at night, even if she was brushing her teeth. She said it was rare for people to be stupid, but sometimes it was still scary, as if someone else was in the mirror instead of her, and they only repeated the movements she made. Her brother, of course, made fun of her for it, but the idea must have stayed with her. No one usually breaks into the bathroom at night, so this man usually locked himself inside and started his daily performance. He stands and carefully looks in the mirror. He starts fooling around, then he shakes his head sharply and gives a hand gesture, turning his eyes. In short, he acts like an idiot, but he doesn't take his eyes off the reflection. He thinks to himself, but it would be cool if something else happened, or if the light bulb just blinked and ignored me. And then, the light bulb in the bathroom blinks a couple of times, the tension jumps, and he is distracted. He looks at the mirror and suddenly feels a twisting fear inside him. Something is wrong. No, the reflection is not ignoring him. Everything seems in place, but something has changed. If it had been a photo, he would think someone has done magic on it using Photoshop. The facial features have become sharp and the eyes seem sunken. It's not him, it's someone else. From the realization that he doesn't recognize himself, the guy almost goes crazy. He clung onto the sink and gazed into his own eyes, defying himself. He looked steadily, and as he looked, he began to change. It was no longer a face, it was some kind of British mask, with slightly stretched lips and a different squint. It was a feeling that could not be confused with anything else. People were looking at him. Someone else, not him. He blinked, but the reflection did not. Here, the boy just wanted to fly out of the bathroom, like a bullet, but the door would not open. He pushed himself right against it, but in the mirror, his face was still visible, along with his eyes. They were alien. John didn't know what had happened next. In the morning, his sister opened the door and washed up, and there was his brother lying on the floor, dead. There were cracks on the mirror. John rubbed his tired forehead and, smiling, looked around at everyone, but only Susie returned his smile. "It happens," sighed Ariana, the red-haired girl, and looked down. "I know the story as well, listen up." Simon, who I met only recently, interjected. He was in charge of the trip, organizing it. They say that, in the forest, not far from here, by the way, a girl was brutally raped and left behind. She lost her shoes, and her clothes were dirty. She was shabby and was wandering through the forest. I went out onto the road, hoping that someone would give me a lift and help. But no one stopped, generally speaking. She headed into the forest. They say she died of exposure there, in late autumn. And ever since then, if you drive down that road at night, people say you can see that girl. She walks along the road and is waiting for a lift. If you don't stop for her, an accident is sure to happen to you. You could fly off the road or something. And if I give you a ride, it could go any way. I know a guy who did it. He was driving down the road at night when he suddenly saw that girl walking barefoot. He slowed down, but she didn't even look at him. Well, he leaned out of the window and asked if he could help, right? And he had already realized that something was wrong. It was somehow scary, to the point of being stunned, even though the person was an adult. He felt uneasy, but still smiled tightly and offered help. And then she got into the car, quietly. Well, when he saw her, it was not a ghost after all. The chair was slightly bent, smelled like rot and forest soil. He looked at her thin legs. Everything was covered in blood and scratches. Her hands were the same. But her face was not visible, and her hair was tangled and falling down. He drove at an average speed, afraid of going faster or slower. And when he asked where she needed to go, she had a tongue like a withered leaf. He was driving, so he was wet as a mouse. And the girl sat motionless next to him. It was like a natural corpse. Then, they drove out into some wilderness, and the girl made a hand signal, "Stop." They said she was found frozen in the same spot. He jumped out of the car to open the door. She got out, took a couple of steps aside, and then turned around, and slowly, unreasonably, she pulled her hair back completely, and instead of eyes, two black voids gaped, and a worm moved in an empty socket. He seemed completely petrified, not a single muscle in his face moved. The dead woman turned her back and walked slowly forward. When she reached the foggy edge of the field, it seemed she disappeared, but it didn't save him. Maybe he was just scared, that was all. He got carried out in the middle of oncoming traffic. I was quiet, finishing my cigarette, which I had taken out, unable to tolerate the oppressive atmosphere on their faces and Simon's monotonous voice. "Eric, do you know?" Simon asked, turning around. "I know one," I admitted reluctantly. "But she's not really scary. To be honest, it's not scary at all." "Well, come on, tell me anyway." They had almost told me everything. I nodded. Finally, I remembered the most important thing. "Anyway, listen," I said, throwing out the bowl. Tourists had somehow gathered in the forest, swimming in the river and sitting around the campfire chatting with each other. And then, as they often do, someone suggested starting to tell scary stories. Everyone agreed with the idea. And so they told their stories, some very scary, some rather banal. And no one was even afraid. They listened and asked, tell me. And the one who told the last story suddenly looked at his companions and saw that they were all dead. Of course, the dead were not afraid, and it was as if all they had been talking about had actually happened to them. The last person looked around and could not believe their eyes. He said, "You're all dead, you know?" And one girl looked at him sympathetically and answered in a gentle voice, "So are you, Eric, too? Have you forgotten?" The fire was only barely smoldering, but nobody threw any branches on it. Yes, it was already useless. We didn't need to have a bonfire because the golden edge had already appeared on the horizon. It was almost dawn and we all had to go. The second story. Child of Darkness. Leah was the first woman who I couldn't break up with for a year and a half. No, it wasn't love, but an insatiable passion. My late grandmother told me that it was sexual selection, which in fairy tales is called the second half of an apple. The more you have, the more you want. You can't let go. Leah probably really was a perfect match for me. I was stunned by it more than by alcohol. As an ardent Latino, I wanted her at all hours of the day and night. And that's despite the fact that she had already turned 30 and had 2 kids from different husbands. Those kids, had virtually no impact on Leah. How great it was with Leah. And how frightening it became in the end. On that memorable day, I was at my desk, cramming paragraph after paragraph into another piece of my research. It was summer and the boys were playing soccer outside the window. Pavel and Vadim, Leah's sons, were swimming on river. I was sitting there, suffering, typing some phrases, but my real thoughts were elsewhere. I sighed, then thought about something, God knows what, and woke up to find myself looking at the sofa and seeing her body flash before my eyes. The elevator door slammed. I listened. I was languishing. Finally, she arrived. When I heard the key turning in the lock, I ran to the door. He picked her up and carried her to the sofa, where she was laughing. But this wasn't for long, as I had just unbuttoned my shirt when the doorbell rang. The doorbell rang so hard that it became clear that something had gone wrong. I opened the door and saw a mustached man in a yellow t-shirt standing behind it, holding Vadim, Leah's youngest child. Vadim hung limply in his arms, his deathly pale face thrown back. Leah screamed and put her hand to her mouth, being rocked back against the wall. The man stepped over the threshold and spoke softly, "Your son drowned. We pumped him full of artificial life support, but it doesn't help." The men wanted to flee, to call for an ambulance, but my brother said there's a local hospital nearby. And he carried Vadim inside the room. It was strange. Why hadn't they called for an ambulance to be sent to the scene? The man laid Vadim down on the floor. Pavlik began to cry nearby. They were so different. Pavlik, black-haired and broad-shouldered, Vadim, light and slight. Everything was happening before my eyes, like it was just happening. Pavlik sobbed, "Uncle, uncle, do something, make him come back to life." And Vadim lay there, in a gray t-shirt, his mouth agape. The man glared at us, at Leah, who rushed to the telephone, shaking uncontrollably, her finger refusing to reach the buttons. The man did not say a word of protest, knelt down, and began giving Vadim artificial breaths. But what was the point? It was clear he was beyond saving. And Leah could not make any progress. She was on the verge of complete hysteria. I pushed her away and started typing, busy. Pavlik knelt next to his brother, murmuring something through tears. I could only hear it from the corner of my ear. "Darling, darling, wake up." The cute one came alive. He opened his eyes and shut his mouth and looked at the ceiling. And there was silence, like in a silent movie. A cold wave washed over me from head to toe. Dead people don't come back to life. And his eyes weren't alive, even though they looked alive. I felt so scared I would have run away if I could. But I couldn't move. I stood there and repeated to myself, "It can't be, it can't be." It was unusual and scary, like smelling a dead body, but my mind refused to believe. Leah and Pavlik ran to hug Vadim. But I couldn't help it. Thank goodness they didn't think about me at all. But he remembered me. He looked at me through his dull glasses like a cobra and turned away. Leah took Vadim to the nursery and I saw him off. I sat down at the table and he took a pen. He scribbled something and froze over a sheet. I was sorting out my feelings and wondering if it was possible to believe such a thing. During our 5 years at the Institute, it seemed like a dream. It was hard to believe, but it was true. I had to run away from there, I thought. At that moment, Leah walked in. "They're sleeping," she whispered, and she snuggled up next to me. I jumped. "What are you doing?" I asked. I glanced at her hands and imagined an invisible, noticeable trace of dead skin on the palms of my own hands. Leah slumped into a chair and helplessly threw her head back. "My God, why should I have to suffer such torment?" she whispered. "Well, now I have to guide him by the hand for the rest of my life. After all, he's going somewhere now, and I'll go crazy." "You need a drink," I said, standing up quickly. "Otherwise, hysteria will start. There's no need to hurt children after something like that." I took a bottle of cognac out of the cabinet and poured half a glass for Leah and the whole thing for myself. And from that day forward, some kind of ethereal life began for us. Things would add up over the course of the day, and by then I had already made up my mind I'd leave tomorrow, pack my things, and quietly depart, and overnight, in Leah's arms, all my resolve melted away. I couldn't do this. And I couldn't stay. At night, through the closed doors, during the craziest moments of passion, I felt his snake-like gaze. And it was terrible. Under the gaze of a dead man, my pleasure increased. I plunged into Leah's body, raped her violently, strangled her in my arms, and all the while I was thinking, she is the mother of this man, a werewolf. Oh. And what was he waiting for? I began to wonder. I'm the only one who knows about him, so why is he waiting? If he's waiting and watching, then it means I have some kind of power he can't yet overcome. Wow. He's too calm. He knows, you see, the bastard. What I'll do, how I'll fall under his control. We need to run. We have to run away. I can't. Days have passed, weeks have passed, and the image of those final days was forever etched in his memory, deathly pale, with dull eyes, always wearing the same gray t-shirt that he had been brought in as if it had become part of his body. And what was underneath it? As soon as I asked myself that question, I noticed that his figure was changing. Day after day, but it was only me who noticed it. The fat seemed to flow from his shoulders and back, gathering in a loose fold around his waist. She trembled as if she were made of jelly when she walked. It was with his thinness that it seemed. No. And so, it really was he was decomposing while still alive. His spine poked through his t-shirt like the gnawed tail of a carcass. But no one else noticed except me. At night, I checked Leah before putting her to bed. But she usually smelled of perfume and body. How can I be sure? How can I know for certain? If I knew for sure, I would break these webs. Then a thought occurred to me: if Vadim was dead, then he should not be breathing. You just need to sneak up on him at night and listen. The parquet creaks softly under his bare feet. His heart is pounding in his throat. Sweat trickles down his sides in fear. But he no longer has the strength to live in suspense. After all, he's not going to kill me. With my brother and my mother. There are people around, thousands of people. If I shout, they'll run right away. Vadim is lying on his left side, facing the wall. The moon shines on his skinny shoulder. His hand is on top of the blanket. I stop 2 steps away from the bed and listen. I can't hear anything. Pavlik sniffs very loudly. Another step, and my legs refuse to move. I lean over him and hold my breath. Suddenly, his hands trap me on the back of my head and the mouth grins terribly. Teeth, dazzlingly white in the moonlight. Unnaturally large, they grow in front of our eyes, stretched out with curved fangs. I scream wildly. He breaks free. With one-man jump, he rushed through the room and, in an instant, was already sitting on the bed. "Leah, blinking sleepily, asked in a frightened voice, "What happened?" "I had a nightmare," he said. And I hear a quiet, malicious laugh from behind. And I'm thinking he was the one laughing behind my back when I left his arms. "You bastard." And immediately, a foul stench hits my face. A spasm catches my throat, and the smell gets into my nose, clogs my lungs, and I run to the bathroom. I'm vomiting. After washing and rinsing my mouth, I return and collapse on the bed. Pavlik looks in on us. At first, I tense up, thinking that he has come to enjoy the effect. But no, the person standing in the doorway has dark hair. Leah stands up and waves to her son, go on, nothing interesting. I need to rest. Otherwise, you won't be able to go to school tomorrow." He slams the door and hugs me. I lay there, cold and trembling, only my body shakes incessantly. For the first time, I didn't respond to her caress. For the first time, I didn't want to. Finally, I decided I'll leave tomorrow. But I couldn't go in the morning. The boys didn't go to school that morning. Pavlik coughed and sneezed and had a fever. Vadim tried it too, and it turned out to be elevated. I remember he gave his mother the thermometer and grinned at me with a smile. 37.5, says Leah. It's from a week-old corpse. But I had already developed a plan. I would send Leah to the pharmacy and pack my things while she was gone. The boys were in one room and I was in the other. It was not difficult. I would shout from the door, "I won't be long." They were calling for work. That was all. But that was not what happened. Leah did not go to the pharmacy but called a doctor. The doctor was sitting waiting. He never came. I told her to go and I could handle things perfectly well on my own. She was not convinced. Of course, she would leave and suddenly the doctor would come. I would answer his questions. And she, trust men, and waved her hand. I also waved. I was waiting. But the doctor never came and never went. The boys dragged a sleeping bag into our room and laid down on the floor, playing around. Leah sat and read, occasionally shouting at her sons so that they would not get too angry, otherwise they might catch up to the temperature. And then, the boy made a joke. He came up to me and stood in front of me, grinning maliciously. Go, go. I waved at him, and he came even closer. Instinctively, I put my hands up in front of my body, and he turned around and pressed his back against my palms. Just that thick crease above his lower back. And I felt his body was soft under his t-shirt. My vision became blurry. I came to my senses, realizing they were messing with the bag again. I was completely dumbfounded when suddenly everything happened. Vadim crushed Pavlik, biting into his throat with his teeth and tearing sideways like a wolf, blood gushing from the slit throat. The man's face had been blackened, only the eyes and teeth glistening pinkly with blood on it. The nails extended out like yellow claws, and the small child began to tear into his brother's chest with them, howling. I don't remember much else. Then, everything is secondhand. It turns out that seconds later, the doctor rang the doorbell. He heard inhuman howling, wild heartbreaking screams, and followed the police. The door was broken down and 2 bodies were found in the apartment. One hadn't had a chance to cool down, the other had been a long time ago, about 2 weeks. I was discovered unconscious near the couch, covered in blood. The most significant thing was that there was blood on my lip as well. A crazy woman was seated in an armchair, howling, swaying from side to side like a pendulum. I have a lot of free time and often think about 2 unsolved mysteries. Where did Pavlik's blood come from on my lip? How did Vadim turn into a ghoul, since for that, another ghoul must have bitten through his throat and drank blood? It's not as simple as that. It's not something that's transmitted. It's not the flu, it's 2 things. Maybe I'll be able to get out of this place someday, and maybe not. What if I become a ghoul too, and just hide and wait to be released? Why do I need to bite idiots? They're already good enough, whispering, making gestures in the air, looking around. Those who have already become attached to the invisible world see it half blindly, and it torments them now. And who am I? Am I a lurking creature? They say I have completely gray hair. I don't know if that's true.
Subscribe to the channel.